Afternoon, everybody. Hope y'all are doing fantastic. Hope y'all are staying warm. Hopefully you had a little bit of fun in this weather. Also, if not, there's always the summer. And it'll be here sooner rather than later. But we're going to wrap up our series on the King and his kingdom today. But think about the last few days. Have you watched a movie or a series or read a book where everything seemed to be falling apart, and then suddenly everything changed? And that's really going to be what we're focusing on today, because that's exactly what the resurrection of Jesus is. It's that moment where everything seemed hopeless. I mean, Jesus had lived a perfect life, and yet they still found a way to kill him. But he didn't stay dead. And really, the resurrection of Jesus, that's the center of our story. That's where everything changes. And since Jesus didn't stay dead, that hope is real. And that, which also means his kingdom is unstoppable. Even death can't stop it. Then nothing else can. I mean, and hope is something we're designed for. I mean, we love stories where it just seems hopeless and then suddenly it changes. Right? I'm reminded of, not to be a little nerdy, but the Lord of the Rings here, where they've been fighting for days, and then suddenly the reinforcements show up. And that's what the resurrection does for us. It gives us hope, right? We know that life doesn't always feel hopeful, right? We see brokenness all around us. We see it globally, locally, personally, right? We see loneliness, injustice, pain. We feel those things also, like fear, shame, doubt, and even disappointment. So much so that sometimes it doesn't seem like God is gonna show up. So much so that sometimes we wonder if healing is even possible, if change can happen, if that darkness will actually go away. But thankfully, the resurrection happened. That's not that darkness not lifting is not the story that the gospel tells, right? Because the King came, he showed up, brought his kingdom, and he didn't even let death stop him. Because Jesus rose from the dead, right? He defeated death. He introduced a new way of being human, a new kind of future, a new kind of hope, right? The gospel is good news because Jesus is in fact alive. And he's still changing lives. We're going to be in Mark 16. We're going to start in verse 1. Give you guys a couple of moments if you have your Bible to flip there real fast. Before we get into Mark 16, some context, right? That's super important. This chapter really picks up after the crucifixion. Jesus had been buried in his tomb. The disciples were scattered. They were grieving, right? They just spent 3 years with this guy. And everything felt hopeless. Hope was fading. Those closest to Jesus were left wondering, what on earth are we going to do? But let's look at verse 1. I've got the ESV here, so if yours is a little bit different, that's fine. But verse 1, when the Sabbath was past, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so that they might go and anoint his body. And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb. Right, those women were some of Jesus's followers. Right, even his mom, the mother of James. Right, James was Jesus's brother. So, followers of his, they were extremely devoted to him. And they showed up to properly prepare his body. Right. If we backtrack to the crucifixion, Jesus had died, and because it was Passover, as soon as he died, they immediately pulled his body down and put him in the tomb. And so there wasn't proper time to prepare him. But let's keep going in verse 3. And they were saying to one another, the women who were going to anoint, to prepare Jesus' body, they were saying to one another, who will roll away the stone for us from the entrance of the tomb? And looking up, they saw that the stone had rolled back, and it was very large. And entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they were alarmed. Right? They were scared. They saw this dude. They were seeing the unexpected. Right? Everything that they were expecting was completely different. The unexpected. They were talking about how in the world they were going to move that stone, but it had already been moved for them. Right? It was literally impossible for them to move him. Right? In fact, what we know from the other Gospels is that there were soldiers who were placed in front of the tomb to guard the tomb, so that nobody could be like, hey, Jesus is resurrected, when he wasn't. Right? And because of that, any attempt to interfere would have been problematic. I mean, most scholars say that the stone wasn't rolled away to let Jesus out. It was moved so that others could actually see the truth. The truth that the tomb was empty. The truth that Jesus had, in fact, risen from the dead. But let's keep going, right? Because it doesn't stop there. Verse 6. And he, being this person, this figure in white robes, he said to them, do not be alarmed. Don't be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who is crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where he was laid. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you. Right? The angel knew the truth. Right? The angel says that this was the Jesus who was crucified. You're at the right place. But he's risen. He's not dead. Death didn't win. The tomb is empty and the king is alive. I mean, honestly, how crazy is that to hear that this guy that they had been following for 3 years, that they knew was crucified 3 days ago. They knew where he was buried, but he wasn't there. Talk about a change. Everything was now completely different. And this is more than just some cool miracle. This is a cosmic shift. Because if Jesus conquered death, then every promise that he made is absolutely trustworthy. Every hope that he offered is completely secure. Every fear that we carry can be met with courage. You see, the resurrection of Jesus is the beginning of a new story. A new story that we've said from the beginning, you are invited into. But it doesn't stop there. Let's go to verse 8. And they, the women, went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. They were met with the complete unexpected. Met with a figure they never expected to meet. I mean, let's be honest. We all would be afraid too. Even though the resurrection is true, though, it does take time to process. And I think that's what we see these women going through. That expectations were completely defied. And so they left. And in the time it takes for them to go from the tomb back to the disciples, they got to think it over. They got to talk it through with each other. And sometimes that's where we're at, where we need to talk it through, where we need to just kind of mull it over a little bit. Take time to process. Right? I mean, we believe in Jesus. But if we're being honest, we're still learning to live in the light of what his resurrection means for us, especially in our everyday life. We kind of know what it looks like on Sundays and Wednesdays, but what about the other days? Sometimes that's a little bit tricky. If we're looking at this verse, I mean, the angel told the ladies to go and to tell the disciples what they had saw. And they did. And they were probably shocked. They were trembling. They were astonished. They just went back. They just reported what they had seen and how everything changed. You see, the gospel is good news because Jesus is alive. It's not wishful thinking. It's anchored in real events. In fact, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul actually says that, upwards of 5,000 people saw Jesus resurrected. That's crazy. And we see in other parts, like in the book of Acts, that, the Pharisees even knew that Jesus wasn't in the tomb. And so all these people, they understand the reality here, that Jesus is actually alive. But what they miss sometimes is that because Jesus is alive, that means that our past doesn't define us. It doesn't define our future. It means that God actually keeps his promises. It means that death doesn't have the final say. It means we don't have to be stuck in shame. We don't have to walk in fear. We don't have to stay in the dark. Since Jesus is alive, our lives get to be different. Since his kingdom is moving forward, I mean, we have to understand, how do we live in light of that? And simply put, we get to choose hope when things feel difficult. We might feel stuck in life. We might feel sad. We might be sad. We might be hurt. We might be afraid or anxious or shameful. But because of what Jesus did, it reminds us that the story's not over. We get to choose to keep trusting when life doesn't make any sense. But we probably need to clarify a little bit. Hope isn't pretending like everything's fine. Hope isn't ignoring how we feel. But hope is believing and trusting that Jesus is still working, that he is still the king, that he is still in control, even in the midst of our chaos. Because the king is alive, we're invited into something new. If we want to be part of this. Right? The news of Jesus' resurrection wasn't just for these women that were first to the tomb. It wasn't just for the disciples. It wasn't just for those 500 people who saw Jesus resurrected. It was for everybody. It was for us. And since Jesus is alive, we too are called to go and tell as many people as we can, right? We're part of the mission of God to advance his kingdom, to advance his gospel. So we don't have to be stuck in shame. We don't have to be ruled by fear. We don't have to feel fear. We're filled with identity. We're filled with purpose and belonging, which accomplishes God's plan for our lives. And let's be honest, the empty tomb says it all. The gospel is good news because Jesus is alive, because he still changes lives. And that's the power of resurrection. That's the heartbeat of his kingdom. So I would encourage you, step into this story that the resurrection opened. You've seen the king. You've heard his call. And we know the cost. And now you know the hope. And that kingdom, that king isn't just for some day out there in the future. It's for now, and it's for you. I love you guys. I hope y'all have a great evening, and I hope, just like the rest of the staff, we look forward to seeing you next week.